At the Mus Farm pile dwelling, 49 of the pots that were found at the settlement were bowls, divided between fineware and coarseware. Finewares, which are vessels made with thinner walls and with fewer sizable coarse inclusions, were 4 times more common than coarseware. One of the unusual things about Mus Farm's ceramic assemblage, not just its size and its quality, is the composition of different vessel types. So at most archaeological sites that we would come across of this period in the region, there would be more courseware storage jars than there would be bowls and cups. But at Mus Farm we have a very similar number of courseware jars to fineware vessels. And that's really interesting because we know from Mus Farm that this is an assemblage that's largely a living assemblage. It's the pots that people would have been using every day and breaking. And at the other sites we would encounter, they tend to be from a longer period of time. So we think that storage vessels may be overrepresented in those kind of assemblages. Whereas at Mus Farm, we're probably looking at a much more authentic reflection of those different vessel types.
At Mus Farm, quite a lot of the bowls that have been found are what we call fineware. They are thinner, they are more smoothly finished, they are beautifully formed. They are the sorts of pots that you might want to put on the table, you probably would want to eat out of. But how much effort goes into making a piece like that? Well, a courseware bowl, you can actually form a pot of this sort of shape, this sort of size, probably in about 15-20 minutes, and you will have a bowl that will function. To finish this bowl to the level of the fineware takes considerably longer. There's probably about an hour's work in just getting the shine onto this surface. So longer to finish the pot than to actually make the pot. So this really tells us that what they're doing here is really important to them. It's important to end up with a pot which has the look of something of quality. Now, that might be just because I want to eat my food out of a nice smooth bowl, or it might be because these people are making pots to trade, or that these pots are being moved on, and what you're trying to do is to produce a product which is more desirable to your customer or the people you're sending them on to. We don't absolutely know, but what we do know is a lot more effort goes into making that than just a coarse surface pot. If you are making thin-walled pots, you are using less material in each vessel. And this clay does take quite a lot of processing. It's a difficult clay to crush down, it's a difficult clay to prepare, so there's a lot of effort gone into preparing the clay. If you're going to make a pot with it, making a thin pot makes sense. You use less clay per vessel. It's a clay, though, that will tolerate being worked thin, so the desire to actually push it to its limits might well have driven the potters also to make thin pots. When you come to fire this pot, there's moisture. Again, we have moisture that needs to escape from the pot during the firing, and that's the case no matter how well the pot's been dried. There will still be moisture in there that needs to escape. Thick-walled pots can trap that moisture in the core, and if that's the case, it turns to supersteam within the clay and it blows bits off the pot. So firing a thick-walled vessel takes much more care in the firing than firing a thin-walled vessel. You can move faster, you can dry this out quicker, you can get the fire going faster and end up with a pot which is safely fired in a shorter time with less effort. So that is possibly one of the driving factors. Once you've got your pot, and particularly in the case of cooking pots, a thin-walled vessel will transfer heat from the outside of the fire to the contents inside much more evenly, much more quickly. So the heat that you're applying, often by putting a pot into charcoal or something like that, transfers into the inside, and the heat is drawn away from the clay itself. That means that the pot itself does not reach such high temperatures as if you've got a thick-walled vessel. And that means that the pot is less likely to crack, less likely to break, and more durable in the firing, and just gives you a better cooking vessel.
Compared with most late Bronze Age assemblages, the vessels at Must Farm show a high frequency of polish or burnishing, reflecting the high proportion of fineware bowls and cups present.
These pots have been made by skilled individuals, and when I say that, a lot of prehistoric pottery appears to have been made by people in their own homes for their own use. These pots have the look of pieces that have been made by specialists, potters who make far more pots than they could possibly need for their own use. And in doing that, they've acquired a very high level of skill in the making of the pot. And when you look at the forms and the way they've been finished, it's quite apparent that their intention from the start is to make a quality item, something which is desirable. And possibly not just for their own pleasure, but possibly as a trade item.
There is evidence that use did have a direct impact on the surface of some vessels, which is most apparent on the bowls and cups, in particular the burnished pots. This is probably because wear shows at best on the smoothed and burnished surfaces and reflects the fact that the delicate, thin-walled rims and finely moulded features of these pots are more susceptible to damage.
When you eat out of, or put food into, or cook in a pot that's been open fired, low temperature fired, we're talking temperatures probably no more than 800 degrees centigrade, you end up with some of the food that you've put in there soaking up into the pot. Now, that's great news for archaeologists because we can do residue analysis and we can find out sort of information about the things that are being used in those pots.
So we're really lucky as archaeologists at Must Farm in that we actually find food residues in a lot of the pots, which is something that's phenomenally rare for archaeology, particularly in the UK and of the late Bronze Age. But we're faced with an interesting conundrum because on most archaeological excavations, if we were lucky enough to find charred residues or food residues visible in some of these pots, they would probably be from cooking vessels. But at Must Farm, we encounter most of the really heavily charred residues and foodstuffs are actually in regular bowls that people would have been eating from. So we have a little bit of a challenge to kind of understand what would have been cooked regularly and unpicking that relationship.
But the actual act of absorbing things into the surface also helped to waterproof them or to seal the pots. So again, you know, in modern terms, it doesn't sound very great, but the surface of the pots would often be sealed by the food that was put into them. And I've worked with potters in Africa who would put milk in there and boil it as the first thing. Other potters who would put a thin porridge in there and cook it in there and soak it into the surface. But these all act as finishers for the surface of the pot.
When we use different techniques as archaeologists to find out more about foods, like microscopy or organic residue analysis, it can be difficult to understand whether or not food contents in the vessels came from multiple cooking phases or whether they were from a single meal. And there was a particularly iconic pot that we found at Must Farm, which was a fineware bowl that still had the spoon sticking out the top of it. And when we've come down and used some of these techniques to analyse it, we found out that the contents were a porridge, which is something that might be, you know, fairly familiar today. However, it was a porridge that would have probably had ruminant meat residues added to it, so kind of meaty juices, possibly from deer. So something that may be a little bit unpalatable by our standards today, but was obviously quite a nutritious meal for people living 3,000 years ago.
Given the circumstances at Must Farm that preserve the contents of the pots, it is possible that the fire occurred around a mealtime when a range of vessels stood containing foodstuffs and beverages ready to be consumed. Could this be connected to the fire?
The contents of the vessels have actually been preserved by the fire that destroyed the settlement. So the intensity of that heat charred the contents of those vessels, which effectively turned it inorganic and prevented it from decaying over time. But that's also been problematic for us as archaeologists because the intensity of the blaze got to such high temperatures that a lot of the contents were actually vitrified. They turned into these glass-like structures. And that change makes it quite difficult to identify elements like cereal grains or possible other foodstuffs. So it's actually made it a bit more tricky for us to unpick those processes. But at the same time, it's given us a lot more questions to explore.
Useware analysis of the ceramics shows scuff marks or abrasion on and around the bases of bowls and cups, presumably caused when they were moved or stacked.
One of my favourite discoveries in the whole of the Muss Farm excavation was a set of pottery vessels that had been stacked inside each other. That really sums up a lot of the Muss Farm story for me, in that even though this was a community of people living in the fens 3,000 years ago, there are so many recognisable elements of their lifestyle that we can see in our own daily practices.
The quantity of pots is interesting. The fact that they are sometimes made in nests. I mean, pots are made so that pots will stack inside pots, will stack inside pots, will stack inside pots. So we've got beautiful collections of pots where they've been stacked together. And these are obviously being made with an intention to be able to do this.
So we know that the people who were living there, not only did they have a really exciting range of pottery, almost a pot for every different occasion, but they were also taking the time to create vessels that would save space within those roundhouses. And I think that's a really great illustration that even though prehistory is many thousands of years ago, the people who lived there were very similar to the people we are today.